Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. In this podcast, Tim and I, a PRI Senior Director of Communications, and I chat with PRI Senior Fellow Ken Green. Ken's work is focused on energy and the environment, so we took this opportunity to chat with Ken about the recent wildfires, California's climate change policies, what he thinks about presidential candidate Joe Biden's environmental agenda, as well as President Trump's performance on the same issues. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Next Round, Ken.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be with you.
Let's start with the wildfires in California. To date, 2.5 million acres have burned. From Napa Valley to Riverside County, nearly every part of the state has been touched by fires. We go through this every year. Is it Mother Nature's fault, or can good public policy mitigate the damage?
Well, I mean, you put your finger on it with we go through this every year, right? Wildfires are native to California's ecosystem. It's a cycle that should be pretty familiar to everyone who ever lived there. I grew up in Los Angeles, but you have a mild, wet winter and spring that leads to a lot of plant growth. There's a lot of grassy vegetation in California just by the nature of the ecosystem. Late spring comes in and things start to dry out and everything goes brown. And when it gets dried out, it creates a huge amount of fuel on the ground. And by July and August, any kind of spark can set off a wildfire, or even just natural composting underground, lightning, static sparks, and any number of things can set off wildfires. And so it's a regular part. It's an aspect of California's ecosystem. It's both negative and positive. It has beneficial effects for various species that have evolved to use that periodic flame and clearing out of competition to prosper. So it's a double-edged sword, but it's completely natural to the system. Now, that question of what do you do about damages is a very different question, because you're talking about two different things. One is the question of what do you do about keeping people safe and their property safe? That's one kind of mitigation of damages. The other kind of damages is how do we protect particular ecosystems that we think of as a static thing that we want people to be able to visit or see the same way over time, which is very unnatural for ecosystems, right? So to deal with the human damages, the best way that we can do that is by making sure that people actually pay the full cost of their risk-taking by insuring it against their losses for people and property. That would make people automatically decide to do intelligent things like keep fire breaks around their property, build fire-safe structures, make sure that they have access to firefighters, keep their distance from the most flammable zones. That would reduce the harm a lot by simply reducing the number of people who say, I really love to live here, and without thinking, well, yeah, it's going to burst into flames every 5 years. That's really how we can deal with the people part. The management of the fire part, for the sake of protecting certain ecosystems, we want it at static parks. Well, that would be nice, but frankly, people kind of suck at it. And nature's simply too big and complex to manage as if it were a park, or even worse, as they do on some university campuses, they make it look like a cemetery with, the trees are groomed within an inch of their life, and it looks like some sort of a weird Twilight Zone set. But a lot of people, and the probably reason we're not good at it is because, one, it's expensive. Two, it's a very large undertaking. And three, everybody disagrees on what to do with managing it. Do you suppress fires? Do you allow fires? Do you trigger fires, controlled fires? Because people keep shifting from one election to the next, and one political party in charge to the next, it never seems to work. In that regard, we have to simply accept that nature is not Disney, and fires are going to happen.
And it's also the season for brownouts, which makes California the butt of jokes, such as President Trump's line at the Republican National Convention, how can Joe Biden claim to be an ally of the light when his own party can't even keep the lights on? As an environmental scientist and engineer, give us your perspective on why California is having so much trouble managing its power.
Sure. Well, California's seasons have always been the butt of jokes since I was a kid. There's toxic air season, earthquake season, fire season, followed by mudslide season, then there's riot season, and of course, there's, worst of all, every year the new television season. So the seasons in LA have always been a joke. I'm reminded of Johnny Carson, an ancient comedian back before most people's time, who said that the reason he never liked traveling out of Los Angeles was because he realized he couldn't trust the air because he couldn't see it. So California's history as the butt of jokes is a long one. As for the Trump and Biden thing, well, California has only really one political season, which is the silly season. And so what politicians say about each other is about as serious as the latest Hollywood productions. But California's problems really come down to two things. One, the climate. Again, a natural part of the climate in California, especially Southern California, where the geographic conditions favor air pollution concentrating down, the air atmosphere compressing down and bringing concentrating pollutants up, especially in the summertime, along with a lot of contributors to pollution, including, as Ronald Reagan was correct, natural background pollution that's generated by all that green foliage that will eventually contribute to wildfires. And so the part of it's geographical, and part of it is also that you're living in California, and California living there requires a lot of power to give you a quality of life. You have to transportation distances are long, summers are hot. There's a lot of, you need to use a lot of power. And so that's the challenge they have, is using power, generating enough power while they're in an environmentally susceptible place to air pollution. And so what they've done is that they've always been very ambitious about cleaning the air. And over the years, the policymakers have just overshot the limits of how fast you can make that balance work and have your power and have less pollution. And their ambition has generally outstripped their ability to make it happen. So they've banked on a bunch of bets that, for example, wind and solar would be able to replace natural gas power or nuclear power. And they made that gamble that even though they know that the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine, they figured, well, technology, those great guys up in Silicon Valley will figure out a way to store that power in large scales, or they'll build so many of them over such a vast, smart, computer-driven grid that they won't have to store it because they'll pull it from Poughkeepsie when it's not being generated in Riverside. But the problem is none of that has worked. There is no large-scale storage, and there is no super omnipresent smart grid to distribute power all over the country. So they're basically, because they've let their other natural gas backup power languish, they're running short of power. When the wind stops blowing and the sun isn't shining and it's particularly hot, they just don't have enough power to deal with the problems, keep the lights on and the air conditioning. And their answer to that was to buy it from others, to make an arrangement with other states that when they ran short, they could buy it. But I guess being politicians, it never occurred to them that if you're in a desert and it's hot in the summertime and you're going to buy power from somebody else, you probably don't want to be buying it from somebody else who is in an even hotter desert in the summertime. So this time, of course, Arizona and Nevada didn't have enough power to sell California, and so California had brownouts. But there's generally, you'll notice a trend through this whole conversation of, in California, the dreams have always outpaced capabilities. And when they fall behind, they don't have a way to pick up the slack. It's always messy.
Along the same themes of, impossible dreams, the state has mandated that California place 5 million zero-emission vehicles on the road by 2030. And in this recent legislation, lawmakers have actually even doubled down by requiring truck manufacturers to put about 300,000 zero-emission trucks on the road by 2035 to help cut down on diesel fuel. Discuss the environmental as well as the economic consequences of these types of mandates.
Well, the zero-emission vehicle mandates are one of the biggest of the deja vu components of my life. The very first op-ed I published in a major publication in the US was in the Los Angeles Times, and it was about the California electric car mandate, or the first ZEV mandate. And that was in 1995, right after I finished school. And it seems like I've weighed in on that every 5 years. In fact, I have since then, practically able to write the exact same editorial because nothing has really changed. The mandates are go into place. The technologies are not there to meet them. They're certainly not affordable to meet them. Enough people scream that the legislators say, okay, we'll move the target by another 5 years, but it never goes away. And last time they tried this with trucks, for example, somebody pointed out that your diesel truck, the life expectancy of the engine is measured in years and maybe even decades. The cost is unbelievably expensive, and the number of manufacturers who can convert them to natural gas is very small. And so moving toward these targets, the targets are unattainable in the real world. They keep doing this time after time. Everybody spends a huge amount of money trying to either comply or to explain why they can't comply. And electric vehicles are just one more bet. There's the bet here in electric vehicles is that they'll overcome people's range anxiety. For those California drivers like myself who commuted between San Diego and Los Angeles on a regular basis, they'll get enough mileage that people will say, okay, I can go with an electric vehicle now. And to give them credit, they have, as long as you're really wealthy and can afford basically a genteel sports car at the high end of the cost range. And to make it worse, those cars are subsidized for the wealthy with taxes on the middle and lower economic classes. And that's been true actually since 1880, because electric cars, people don't realize, electric cars came before gas cars. It's just that they kept losing out in capability to the gasoline cars, and they have ever since.
Several years ago, when the trend was just beginning, you wrote a policy brief for PRI on the problems of banning plastic bags. Well, today the entire state of California has banned plastic bags, and so have several other states. You argued at the time that reusable bags are not necessarily more environmentally efficient and that they can be carriers of viral and bacterial diseases. Well, today the lack of plastic bags has worsened the unsanitary conditions among the homeless, and moreover, because of the coronavirus, plastic bags are now making a comeback. So here's your chance to say, I told you so.
Unfortunately, over my career, I've amassed too many opportunities to say I told you so, whether it's plastic bags or electric cars or wind and solar power. But I will say it, I told you so. The plastic bag fetish never made much sense, no more sense than many recycling things, because it doesn't make sense economically, and worse, it doesn't make sense environmentally. So it turns out to make alternatives to plastic bags, you wind up using more energy, you wind up using more raw natural resources, you wind up reusing bags, which means you have to launder them, which means you use more hot water and more detergents and more waste generated. And whereas the plastic bags use an extremely tiny amount of material, and it turns out that if you really pay attention to the science, they do break down over time in landfills and in the environment. So they never really made much sense. But as you pointed out also, people every couple of weeks you read about a salmonella outbreak from somebody buying lettuce, right? From produce. Well, somebody bought that produce and they went to the store and they stuck it in their cloth bag and they took it home and they unpacked it and they put it in the refrigerator and they put the bag away and they ate the lettuce and they got sick and they forgot about it. Then they went shopping again and they took the same bag and then they put another head of lettuce in the same bag, exposing it to the salmonella that they left there the last time. And so they reinfect themselves. And so if you don't sterilize the bags, again, hot water, a hot dryer, detergent, bleach, etc., you could spread disease with those bags. And there have been recorded instances of entire sports teams getting sick on a bus because they shared food out of a contaminated bag. A women's volleyball team, I believe it was. Plastics, that's a great thing. If anybody out there listening who wants to sponsor a guy writing a book, I think plastics really need a defender in our society, because they're just a really revolutionary technology that lets us avoid using things like water, woods, stones, soil, and steel because we make them out of oil, and they eventually return to basically break down back into oil and get eaten by various forms of life. But there are medical technologies people take for granted, like intravenous bags and plastic tubing, the ventilators that are keeping people alive in COVID, your cell phone that summons the ambulance when you need it, the fire department when you need it, and I would argue sometimes the police when you need them. There's a million different things that plastics have actually done to protect the environment, and just nobody even thinks about it. So the development of cell phones is a great example where in China, because cell phones were developed in the United States and it uses plastics and uses wireless technology, China was saved the trouble of going to the entire cycle of building 87 trillion wooden creosote covered poles, hanging copper wires, digging up all that copper, then replacing it with fiber optic cable, and then replacing it with coax cable, etc. They went straight to wireless, right? That was a massive environmental benefit nobody even thinks about, that came because plastics were invented in industrial civilizations and created brand new safety opportunities and things that eased up the burden on the earth. Today, though, plastics, are sort of demonized. So there's no easy way to talk about dealing with plastic pollution. But I think most people realize as soon as COVID hit, pretty much 3 of these wars were ended. One is the war on plastic bags. The other one was the war, a less known war on sanitary wipes. The sewer people didn't like sanitary wipes, and so they were trying to get those banned. And Lysol and disinfecting wipes for countertops and things, they were under attack, and paper towels as well. I don't think any of those things are going to be under attack again anytime soon.
Well, let's turn to the goings-on in Washington. Despite the fact that California is struggling with brownouts, Senate Democrats rolled out a California-style climate change plan that calls for spending $400 billion annually to achieve net zero emissions no later than 2050. The plan also guarantees that 40% of the benefits would go to minority and disadvantaged communities. So PRI published several years ago a study arguing that the best way to reduce the power bills for low-income families is more market-based policies. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, as I said, California Dreamin' is a great pop song, but it's not a great formula for success. And the dream of the net zero emission target for 2050 is just another round of California policymakers saying, picking a, quote, ambitious, others would say unattainable target, and then throwing massive amounts of taxpayer money at the target and having a festival of spending on their chosen technologies and their friends who are manufacturing it and their donors who are manufacturing it. And each time, of course, the dream falls through and a new crop of politicians comes in to come up with a new California dream. The problem is that these things, all those failures have consequences. And not surprisingly, in California, power is expensive. Now power is scarce. And emissions have declined, but they're not getting anywhere close to a net zero possibility by 2050. So it's another unreachable star. It's another unattainable plan, and therefore it allows for unlimited amounts of spending from the politicians' point of view, because they've created a all or nothing save the world goal that's the most important thing in the entire world, and yet they won't be in office when it doesn't work, but the money will already be spent. So I agree with your work, PRI's work, and others, which is the best solution for this is to figure out how to balance greening the world, which everybody wants, and also providing enough power for people to flourish and better themselves and their children. And I think using markets is the best way to do that. No one decision maker has the wisdom to say, we should get 32.3% of our power from wind, another 22.2% from solar, and this much from natural gas, and we'll allow maybe for one backup hydropower dam. There's no decision maker that has the knowledge to get that right, because things change and people's needs change. So using markets where you allow people to say how much money, what kind of power they want, what they're willing to pay for it, who they want to buy it from, how they want it made. That's the way to tap the wisdom of the entire society. And I think it's going to be more successful at making that balance between clean and prosperous than arbitrary targets that always end in round numbers. Net zero 2050. If it was 2025, it would be 55 by 2025, right? 2050, whatever. They're only round numbers, but the round numbers don't actually translate to reality. So we can talk about more solutions, but to do that, we'll need a few dozen more podcasts.
Well, not to be outdone, presidential candidate Joe Biden recently announced a new climate justice plan that would direct nearly half the benefits of a proposed $2 trillion clean electricity investment to poor and minority communities. Biden's plan also promises to phase out natural gas, coal, and oil-fired power plants by 2035. Is this realistic, or is it designed to appeal to the far left of his party?
Well, so two things. One, is it realistic? And the answer is, in 15 years, to phase out all of the natural gas, coal, and oil-fired power plants is completely unrealistic in the United States. The life expectancy of those facilities is measured in decades, their economic life. And so just on the economic side, phasing them out would be a problem. But then keeping the lights on, if you did close them out and were willing to take massive losses, is also a serious problem that won't be satisfied in 15 years. Vaclav Smil, who's a Canadian researcher on energy policies, considered one of the world's leading authorities, points out that almost every energy transition we've ever gone through, whether it was from wood to coal or from peat to coal, and then to coal to gas, and gas to oil, and so forth, they take 50 years at a time to really make a significant change. So anybody's talking about 15, 20 years to make significant changes like that, really they don't know what they're talking about, or they are intentionally being disingenuous. So I'd have to say that it's a silly thing. The distinction between Biden and Trump, which is something as a libertarian, I'm just not really about being far left versus the far left and far right. But I think the question is, are you harming people by imposing your values on their life? And when they say we're going to phase out all of these conventional energy sources by 2035 without a realistic expectation of replacing the benefits of those things and at a reasonable cost, I think it's bad policy, because I think it's going to hurt people. It's going to cost them more money. It's going to make their lives harder. It's going to give them less opportunities. And I think basically it's simply a bad idea.
In contrast to Biden's proposals, give us your take on Trump's energy and environmental policies over the last 3.5 years. What do you agree with? What don't you agree with? And what could he do better if reelected? And if you're going to give him a grade, what would that be?
Oh boy, I'm beginning to think you don't like me very much, because actually even entertaining the idea that there could be something positive to say about Donald Trump is likely to actually get me attacked on social media. And if anybody knew where I live, which fortunately they don't, I might get protesters. But there's a lot I don't like about the Trump presidency. I'm not going to go into the details, but there are some things that have happened that I think are overall beneficial to society with regard to energy and environment. So I think the Trump administration focused on keeping all forms of energy production in the mix, whether it's natural gas, whether it's coal, whether it's nuclear, and not arbitrarily picking one and banning it, or picking another one and saying we have to go all in on this. I think that's actually a smart decision, because I think the alternative is going to lead, as I said, to more expensive power, less reliable power, and a smaller economy and smaller opportunities for everyone. I tend to agree with that approach to generating power. Trump is also in favor of not bribing, not using subsidies to bribe people to buy or make electric cars, and force vehicle makers to make electric cars or super compact, super fuel efficient cars, which I agree with. There's also I like to point out that the United States has a serious obesity problem that people don't recognize, and it's actually regulatory obesity. There's a gigantic festooning growth of red tape around the waistline of the United States, and putting the regulatory system on a diet is long overdue. And in the energy and environment area, there have been mounds and mounds of redundant regulations to comply with, contradictory regulations to comply with, outdated ones where there's no longer something there that has to be protected or that has to be avoided, and yet you still have to follow the regulations and pay your lawyers to fill out the forms to stay in business, to follow all those the rules. And it's long overdue for that kind of streamlining and regulatory reduction that Trump has made actually a hallmark of his administration. So I'd have to say that's something that I think I can wholeheartedly say I think that's a good and overdue thing, and needs to continue, because the regulatory obesity has swelled for 50 to 60 years or more. And with the U.S., it used to be a place where you could just go out and do your own thing and start a business and take a risk. And now the U.S. is becoming a permission state, where before you can think about doing anything, you have to obtain permission from 87 different regulatory agencies in the government before you can even think about starting a business or doing things like that. And we need to roll back a lot of that red tape.
You recently left Canada to move back to the United States. In terms of environmental and energy policy, talk about the direction being taken by our neighbors to the north. And also, update our listeners on U.S. and Canada pipeline projects such as Keystone.
Sure. I did move recently from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, to the Las Vegas area. So I literally moved from the deep freezer to the frying pan, choosing to move in the middle of August to Nevada. But I grew up in the desert, so I don't mind that. But Canada's a lot like California, actually, in its energy and environment policy issues. There's this belief that, first of all, the environmental amenity value, that is the value people place on having a super clean, pure environment, is extremely high all across Canada. Much like California, it's really like one of their number one priorities. But they also share the belief that California does, that somehow humans can reduce their environmental impacts and still have things they need to live in a place like Canada, which, in case people hadn't noticed, is cold. It's very cold. It's very broad and very big. It has lots of long transportation distances. And they have to, most of their economy is based on producing natural resources transforming them into goods and services and trading them with other countries. And so they share the sort of Hollywood Willy Wonka idea that if we just dream it, we can have our perfect environment and our great, super strong economy, and the world will love us, and everybody will think we're wonderful, and more people will end their sentences with A, as Canadians do, eh? Unfortunately, just like here, it's not working very well in Canada. So Ontario, their biggest manufacturing province, has seen their energy rates shoot up just tremendously to the point that the manufacturing is leaving, as it did in California. It's leaving the province of Canada, where it generates a huge amount of Canada's economic productivity. So they're really like sort of a very broad California. They're about the same population, really. They're just spread out on a landmass bigger than the United States, one of the biggest land masses in the world, and live in a place that's often easily confused with a meat locker. So it takes an awful lot of power to do it. On pipelines, well, most people may or may not know the original Captain Kirk. William Shatner was a great Canadian, and as Dr. McCoy told him in more than a few episodes with regard to pipelines, it's dead, Jim. Pipelines might happen. Keystone could happen, but the reality is that it's not that pipeline's not enough for Canada to really make use of the oil it has in prairies in Alberta and the neighboring province of Saskatchewan. They need multiple pipelines to actually reach the U.S. market and to get their oil to foreign markets, and Keystone won't be enough for that. But really, the opposition in Canada has reached almost an absolute. They literally protesters were blocking railroad lines and physically obstructing construction and things for weeks and months, and there was absolutely no consequence to doing it, and it worked. So right now it's in the hands of activists, and their attitude is absolutely no pipelines anywhere at any time.
So Ken, for our final question, we call our podcast Next Round because PRI's headquarters is near wine country, and most everyone at PRI likes to drink wine or beer or a cocktail at the end of their day. So we like to ask each Next Round guest if they can offer a beverage recommendation for our listeners. So as you celebrate your move back to the U.S., what are you drinking these days?
Well, I actually grew up, to the extent that I actually did grow up, in working class Los Angeles, in San Fernando Valley. And good times there were more about drinking Corona beer and having shots of tequila. And especially where that is not the thing to do in Canada. Corona and tequila are not really big things there. So for me, I'll take Corona with lime and a shot of Hornitos on the side, with some salt and lime on the side. And you can have the fancy wine, and I'll stick with the cerveza and tequila.
Thanks so much, Ken.
Thank you. Anytime.
Thanks to my colleagues Ken Green and Tim Anaya. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, and now iHeartRadio and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. And if you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.